Ladies and gentlemen, there are stories that exist simply to entertain, stories that pass the time and vanish as quickly as they are told. And then there are stories that endure, stories that linger, that evolve, that follow humanity across generations and landscapes, because they speak to something deeper. The story of the Wendigo is one of those stories. It does not begin with a monster. It begins with a place. Imagine vast northern forests stretching endlessly beneath a sky that grows dim earlier each day as winter approaches. The air becomes sharp, brittle, unforgiving. Snow falls not gently, but persistently, layer upon layer, until the ground disappears beneath a white expanse that seems to erase all sense of direction. In such a place, silence is not peaceful, it is heavy. It presses in from all sides, reminding those who live there that they are small, fragile, and deeply dependent on the balance of the world around them. For the indigenous peoples who lived in these regions, particularly those of the Algonquian language family, this environment was not abstract. It was reality. Survival required knowledge, cooperation, and discipline. It required respect for the land and an understanding of its rhythms. But even with all of that, there were times when survival became uncertain. Winter could stretch longer than expected, game could disappear, supplies could dwindle. Entire communities could find themselves facing hunger not as a distant possibility, but as an immediate threat. And in those moments, the question of survival became more than physical, it became moral. It is from this tension between survival and morality that the Wendigo emerges. The Wendigo is often described as a creature of hunger, but that description, while accurate, is incomplete. It is not hunger alone that defines it, but the nature of that hunger. It is a hunger that cannot be satisfied, a craving that grows stronger with each attempt to fulfill it. It is not simply the absence of food, it is the presence of something insatiable. In early tellings, the Wendigo is not a distant beast lurking in the shadows. It is something far more unsettling. It is close. It is human. Or at least, it was. The transformation into a Wendigo is one of the most important elements of the legend. Unlike many monsters, which are born as something other, the Wendigo often begins as a person, a hunter, a traveler, a member of a community, someone who, under normal circumstances, would be no different from anyone else. But circumstances are not always normal. As hunger sets in and desperation grows, the mind begins to change. Thoughts that would once have been unthinkable begin to surface. The instinct to survive, which is essential in moderation, can become overwhelming. It can override reason, compassion, and restraint. And at the edge of that descent lies a choice. The stories speak of cannibalism not as an act of simple desperation, but as a turning point. It is presented as a line that once crossed cannot be uncrossed. To consume human flesh is not just to break a taboo, it is to open a door. What lies beyond that door is the Wendigo. The transformation is not always depicted in the same way. In some versions, it is immediate and physical, the body changing into something grotesque and unnatural. In others, it is gradual, almost imperceptible at first, a change in behavior, a shift in perspective, a growing distance between the individual and the rest of their community. But regardless of how it unfolds, the result is the same. The person loses their humanity. They become driven by a hunger that eclipses all else. They become isolated, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. They are no longer part of the human world. They are the Wendigo. Descriptions of the Wendigo vary, but they share common themes. It is often depicted as emaciated, its body stretched thin as though it has been starving for an eternity. Its bones press against its skin, creating sharp, unnatural angles. Its face is hollow, its features distorted by deprivation. Its eyes are often described as sunken, yet piercing, filled with a kind of awareness that is both intelligent and predatory. In some accounts, the Wendigo grows larger as it consumes more, its body expanding in a grotesque reflection of its appetite. And yet, despite its increasing size, it never appears nourished. It remains gaunt, perpetually on the edge of starvation. This paradox is central to its nature. The Wendigo consumes, but it is never satisfied. It grows, but it is never fulfilled. It is trapped in a cycle of endless hunger. This idea carries a powerful symbolic weight. It suggests that the act of consuming, of taking more and more, does not necessarily lead to satisfaction. In fact, it may lead to the opposite. It may deepen the sense of lack, creating a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. The Wendigo, in this sense, is not just a creature. It is a warning. It warns against excess, against greed, against the belief that survival or success justifies any action. It reminds those who hear the story that there are limits, and that crossing those limits can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. At the same time, the Wendigo is also connected to the idea of spiritual imbalance. In many traditions, it is not only the act of cannibalism that leads to transformation, but also the presence of a malevolent force, a spirit associated with winter, cold, and starvation. This spirit is said to wander the forests, seeking out those who are vulnerable. It does not simply attack. It influences, it whispers, it amplifies the darker aspects of the human mind, pushing individuals toward actions they might otherwise resist. The idea of possession adds another layer to the legend. It suggests that the danger is not only external, but internal. That the conditions of the environment, cold, isolation, hunger, can create an opening through which something destructive can enter. Whether interpreted literally or metaphorically, this concept reflects a deep understanding of how extreme circumstances can affect the human psyche. It acknowledges that under certain pressures, people can change in ways that are difficult to predict and even more difficult to control. The Wendigo also serves as a reflection of the importance of community. In the harsh environments where these stories originated, survival depended on cooperation. Sharing resources, supporting one another, and maintaining social bonds were not just ideals, they were necessities. The Wendigo represents the breakdown of those bonds. It is the ultimate form of isolation, a state in which the individual is completely cut off from others, both physically and emotionally. It is the consequence of prioritizing the self above all else. In this way, the legend reinforces the idea that survival is not just an individual effort, but a collective one. It emphasizes that the well-being of the group is essential, and that actions which harm the group ultimately harm the individual as well. As the story of the Wendigo spread beyond its original context, it began to change. Different cultures encountered it, interpreted it, and adapted it to their own frameworks. Over time, new elements were added, and the image of the Wendigo evolved. In modern representations, the Wendigo is often depicted as a towering monstrous figure, sometimes with antlers, claws, and other exaggerated features. These depictions, while visually striking, are not always consistent with the original accounts. They reflect a blending of influences, a merging of traditional stories with contemporary ideas of horror. Despite these changes, the core themes remain. The Wendigo is still associated with hunger, transformation, and loss of humanity. It still represents a crossing of boundaries, a descent into something darker. In contemporary society, the legend of the Wendigo continues to resonate, but often in new ways. It is no longer tied exclusively to the physical conditions of winter and starvation. Instead, it can be seen as a metaphor for other forms of insatiable desire. In a world where consumption is often encouraged, where growth is seen as inherently positive, the idea of endless hunger takes on a different meaning. It can represent the pursuit of wealth without limit, the accumulation of resources without consideration for sustainability, the desire for power that overrides ethical considerations. The Wendigo becomes a symbol of what happens when desire is allowed to expand without restraint. It illustrates the potential consequences of a mindset that prioritizes acquisition over balance, taking over sharing, and individual gain over collective well-being. At the same time, the psychological dimension of the Wendigo remains relevant. The idea that a person can change under extreme conditions, that they can lose their sense of self, their connection to others, their moral compass, is something that continues to be explored in various fields, from psychology to literature. The Wendigo embodies the fear of that transformation. It represents the possibility that the line between human and inhuman is not as fixed as we might like to believe. That under certain circumstances, that line can blur. This does not mean that the legend is pessimistic. On the contrary, it also highlights the importance of resisting that transformation. It suggests that even in the face of extreme pressure, there is a choice to be made. A choice to maintain one's humanity, to uphold values, to remain connected to others. The existence of the Wendigo as a warning implies the existence of an alternative. It implies that there is a path that does not lead to transformation, a way of surviving without losing oneself. This duality is part of what gives the legend its enduring power. It is not simply a story about a monster. It is a story about human nature, about the tension between instinct and morality, between survival and identity. It asks difficult questions, not by providing answers, but by presenting a scenario in which those answers must be considered. It challenges listeners to think about what they would do, how they would act, where they would draw the line. And in doing so, it remains relevant. Because while the specific conditions that gave rise to the Wendigo, harsh winters, isolation, starvation, may not be experienced by everyone, the underlying themes are universal. The struggle between need and restraint, between desire and discipline, between self and community, these are challenges that exist in many forms, across many contexts. The Wendigo persists because it speaks to those challenges. It provides a framework for understanding them, a narrative through which they can be explored. It is also important to recognize that the legend is part of a broader cultural context. It is not an isolated story, but one that exists within a rich tradition of storytelling, knowledge, and belief. It reflects the values, experiences, and perspectives of the communities that created it. Approaching it with respect means acknowledging that context, understanding that it is more than a piece of entertainment. It is a cultural expression, a way of conveying meaning and preserving knowledge. As we consider the Wendigo today, we can see it not only as a figure from the past, but as a concept that continues to evolve. It appears in books, films, and other forms of media, each time adapted to new audiences and new contexts. In some cases, these adaptations focus on the horror, emphasizing the creature's appearance and behavior. In others, they explore the deeper themes, using the Wendigo as a lens through which to examine issues of identity, morality, and society. Both approaches contribute to the ongoing life of the legend. They ensure that it remains visible, that it continues to be discussed and reinterpreted. And yet, at its core, the Wendigo remains what it has always been: a story about hunger, a story about transformation, a story about the limits of human behavior. It reminds us that there are boundaries, both physical and moral, that define who we are. It suggests that crossing those boundaries can lead to consequences that extend beyond the individual, affecting the community and the world around them. It also reminds us that those boundaries are not always easy to maintain, that they can be challenged by circumstances, by pressures, by the basic instinct to survive. The tension between these forces is what gives the story its power. It is what makes it more than just a tale of fear. It is a reflection of the human condition. In the end, the Wendigo is not simply something to be feared. It is something to be understood. It represents a possibility, a path that can be taken, but does not have to be. It illustrates the consequences of certain choices, but it also highlights the existence of other choices. It invites reflection. It encourages awareness. It challenges assumptions. And perhaps most importantly, it endures. Because as long as there are moments of uncertainty, of pressure, of temptation, moments when the line between what is necessary and what is right becomes unclear, the story of the Wendigo will continue to have meaning. It will continue to be told, and it will continue to remind us of what it means to remain human.